James Harper had everything: power, money, control. But in the middle of a high-stakes meeting, a call from an unknown number shattered his perfect world. A soft, uncertain voice on the line asked, "Are you my dad?" And just like that, the man who thought he had planned every detail of his life discovered the one thing he never expected: a daughter. James Harper had built a life most people only dreamed about. He was the CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech firms in the country, a self-made millionaire with penthouses in 3 cities, a fleet of luxury cars, and a calendar so tightly managed that even personal time came in 15-minute slots. Everything in his world was controlled, calculated, and efficient. Emotion had no place in his daily agenda, and unpredictability was something he paid other people to eliminate. He'd convinced himself that this was the only way to live: clean, structured, untouchable. He was in the middle of a high-level meeting with investors when his personal phone, the one that rarely rang, buzzed on the conference table. He ignored it at first, focused on the slideshow being presented. But when it buzzed again, then a third time, something in his gut told him to answer. He excused himself from the room, walked out into the hallway, and answered the call. "Hello?" he said sharply, still thinking it might be a client or an assistant. There was a pause, then a small, uncertain voice came through the line. "Hi, are you my dad?" James froze. At first, he thought it had to be some kind of mistake. A prank. But the voice was too real, too honest. A child. A girl. She couldn't have been older than 6 or 7. "Who is this?" he asked, his tone quieter now. "My name is Lily. I'm 6. Mommy's in the hospital and she won't wake up. She said if something ever happened to her, should call this number. I found it in her bag." His mouth went dry. The hallway around him blurred for a moment as he leaned against the wall, trying to understand what he'd just heard. Lily. Hospital. Unconscious mother. A number saved for emergencies. And then, like a lightning bolt, the name came back to him: Kate Maddox. He hadn't thought about her in years. Their relationship had been brief but intense. She was creative, full of life, and totally unlike anyone he'd known. He remembered her laughter, her independence, the way she had disappeared from his world just as quickly as she had entered it. He had left for a business expansion on the East Coast and never looked back. They had lost touch. And now, here he was, standing alone in a hallway, holding a phone to his ear while a 6-year-old girl claimed to be his daughter. "Where are you?" he asked, his voice now steady but urgent. "St. Bridget's Hospital," the girl said. "In Denver." Without hesitation, James turned around, walked back into the conference room, and picked up his coat. The meeting halted mid-sentence as everyone stared. "I have to go," he said. Something more important just came up. He didn't offer an explanation. He didn't need one. For the first time in years, something had shattered his perfectly organized life, and he didn't try to fix it or ignore it. He just moved. Because somewhere in a hospital in Denver, a little girl who might be his daughter was waiting for him. And that was the only thing that mattered now. The hospital looked small from the outside, almost quiet compared to the chaos that had begun to stir inside James the moment he boarded the plane. The private jet had cut travel time in half, but every second still dragged. He had sat frozen most of the flight, the voice of the little girl replaying in his head over and over. He didn't know what he would find, didn't even know for certain if it was real, but something inside him told him it was. And if it was, then everything about the life he thought he understood had already changed. When he walked through the hospital's sliding doors, the cool air and sterile brightness hit him immediately. He approached the reception desk, trying to sound composed as he asked for a patient named Kate Maddox. The nurse looked up at him with a tight expression and asked if he was family. He hesitated for the briefest moment, then said yes. "Room 314, she said. "ICU wing. But visiting hours for non-immediate family are limited." He didn't respond. He was already walking. The hallway was long and quiet, the only sound coming from the soft beeping of machines behind closed doors. He found the room easily. Through the window, he could see her, Kate. Pale, unmoving, her auburn hair fanned across the pillow. A breathing tube. Monitors. She looked impossibly small against the wide hospital bed. She didn't look like the woman he remembered, the vibrant, fearless person who had once danced barefoot in his apartment kitchen at midnight. But she was still her. And she was still alive. Before he could open the door, someone called softly from behind. "Are you James?" He turned. A little girl stood just a few feet away, holding a stuffed bunny by one ear. She had long, pale blonde hair in a messy ponytail, soft features, and the brightest blue eyes he had ever seen, eyes that were, unmistakably, his. He swallowed, suddenly unsure of how to speak. The little girl tilted her head slightly, studying him with the kind of calm only children seemed to possess. "You came," she said, like she wasn't surprised. "I told Mommy you would." James crouched down slowly to her level, not too close, unsure of what she was comfortable with. "Lily?" he asked. She nodded. "That's me." He stared at her, unable to believe what he was seeing. The resemblance was there, not just in her eyes, but in the way she stood, the way she didn't look away when she spoke. She was confident but soft-spoken. He had no idea how someone so small could already feel so familiar. "Do you know why I called you?" she asked. "I think I do," he said carefully. "Your mom, she told you about me?" "Not much. Just that if anything ever happened and she couldn't talk, she'd call this number. That you were my dad, but you didn't know." James felt a strange ache in his chest. The idea that Kate had prepared her daughter for this moment, had trusted her child to make that call, told him everything he needed to know. Kate had never asked him for help, never told him about Lily, never reached out. And yet, she'd given her daughter his number. Just in case. He nodded slowly, voice lower now. "I didn't know. I wish I had." Lily looked at him for a long time, then stepped forward and gently placed her small hand in his. "It's okay. You're here now." And just like that, something cracked open inside of him. He didn't know how to be a father. He didn't know what the next day would look like. But in that quiet hospital hallway, holding the hand of a daughter he never knew existed, James Harper began to understand that nothing about his life, his real life, would ever be the same again. James didn't leave the hospital that night. He had no plan, no overnight bag, no sense of what to do next, but walking away wasn't even an option. After sitting with Lily for nearly an hour, mostly listening as she told him about her school, her favorite cereal, and how she tried to braid her own hair, he watched her fall asleep in a chair beside her mother's bed, curled up with her stuffed bunny and a blanket the nurses had given her. The sight of her like that, so peaceful and small, anchored him in a way he hadn't expected. He pulled a chair beside Kate's bed and sat in silence for a long time, watching the rise and fall of her chest, listening to the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. Kate hadn't changed so much as softened. Her features were still familiar, even under the bruising and the pale hospital light. He wondered how she had managed everything alone for 6 years. He wondered how many times she'd almost called him. He thought about the fact that she never did, and what kind of pride or pain had kept her from reaching out. A nurse eventually came in to check on Kate's vitals and seemed surprised to see James still there. He asked a few questions, about her prognosis, about the trauma, but the answers weren't comforting. She was stable, yes. But still unresponsive. The doctors were monitoring for signs of brain activity, for involuntary movement, anything that might hint at recovery. But for now, it was wait and see. And wait and see had never been part of James Harper's vocabulary. The next morning, he called his assistant and canceled everything. Meetings, travel, calls. When she hesitated, reminding him of how many people were involved in the negotiations scheduled that week, he said firmly, "Family emergency. Indefinite leave." He moved into a hotel 2 blocks from the hospital and visited every day, sometimes twice. Lily began to expect him. They started having breakfast together in the hospital cafeteria, pancakes and orange juice for her, black coffee and whatever she convinced him to try for him. He walked her to the pediatric wing's playroom when nurses insisted she take breaks, and she introduced him to her favorite nurse like he was someone who'd always been there. They didn't talk much about the situation. Lily didn't ask about the past. She didn't need explanations. She simply included him, quietly and fully, in her small world. And James, despite all his years of structured control and isolation, found himself craving that inclusion. One afternoon, as they colored quietly in the waiting area, Lily asked him if he had ever drawn a unicorn. He admitted he hadn't. She handed him a pink crayon and said, "It's never too late to try something new." It was such a simple statement, but it stopped him. He realized then that his whole life had been built on certainty, on numbers, strategy, outcomes. And now, in a quiet hospital hallway, beside a child who had his eyes and her mother's fearless calm, he was beginning something he couldn't plan or predict. That evening, after Lily had gone home with a nurse to get some rest, James returned to Kate's room alone. He sat beside her, took her hand, and spoke aloud for the first time since the night he arrived. "I don't know if you can hear me," he began, voice low, "but I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere." He paused, glancing toward the monitors, then back to her still face. "I didn't know about Lily. But I know now. And she's incredible. Smart, strong, brave. You raised her well. And now it's my turn to be what she needs. I'm not going to run this time. So if you can fight your way back, Kate, we're waiting. We're both waiting." He stayed with her until the room grew dark and quiet and his eyes began to close. For the first time in years, James Harper didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for once, he wasn't afraid of that. James quickly learned that hospitals had their own rhythm, slow and repetitive on the surface, but always carrying a low hum of urgency beneath it. The days began to blur into each other as he settled into a routine that was completely foreign to the life he used to know. Each morning started with coffee that tasted like cardboard and an early check-in with the nurses, followed by hours spent in Kate's room, sometimes reading to her, sometimes just sitting in silence. Every few hours he'd break away to see Lily, who had become a bright, grounding force in his day. She asked questions that no adult dared to, like why the lights in the ICU were always too bright or why the walls didn't have pictures. She had an honesty that pierced straight through him, never rude, only curious, and always brave. One afternoon, James had just finished helping Lily with a simple art project and a woman walked into the waiting area with a clipboard in hand and a carefully measured smile on her face. She introduced herself as a social worker assigned to Kate's case. Her tone was polite but firm as she requested to speak with him privately. James followed her down the hall to a small consultation room, not fully sure what to expect. Once the door closed, she got straight to the point. She explained that because Kate was still in a coma with no known legal guardianship assigned, the hospital had a responsibility to ensure Lily's safety. They were grateful he had stepped in, but technically, he had no legal claim to the child. James felt his stomach knot as she spoke, the thought of someone else stepping in to decide Lily's future hitting him harder than he expected. He assured the social worker that he had every intention of staying involved and that he would do whatever was required to protect her. She nodded, professional but unmoved, and said that paternity would need to be confirmed. The next day, James took a DNA test. There was no doubt in his mind, but he understood the system needed proof. Still, the process made everything feel suddenly fragile. What had started to feel like family was now under scrutiny, and he hated the idea of Lily sensing that shift. But she surprised him again. When he gently explained that some people needed paperwork to understand who he was to her, Lily just shrugged and said, "You're my dad. I already know that. They'll figure it out." James could only smile and nod, feeling something in his chest pull tight. He was struck by how much trust this little girl had already placed in him, even though he had done nothing to earn it before now. She gave freely what most adults held back, and it humbled him. At night, he found himself replaying moments from the past. The last time he'd seen Kate. The way she had kissed him goodbye without bitterness, just a soft sadness in her eyes. She hadn't tried to stop him from leaving. And he hadn't asked her to wait. He realized now that she must have known then, maybe not about the child, but that she wouldn't reach out, that she would raise Lily on her own rather than disrupt his world. He wondered what that said about the man he had been back then, and what kind of man he wanted to be now. Late that evening, James sat once again by Kate's bedside. Her face was still, but somehow softer than before. He spoke to her again, just as he had every day. "I want you to wake up," he said quietly. "Not just for Lily. For you. For us. I know I should have been there. And I can't change that. But I'm here now, and I'm not going to disappear again." As he held her hand, he thought he felt the faintest twitch. It could have been nothing. A muscle reflex. A trick of the light. But James didn't let go. He stayed still, eyes fixed on her fingers, heart pounding with a new kind of hope. The next morning brought with it a kind of quiet James hadn't experienced since arriving in Denver. Something in the air felt different, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. When he arrived at Kate's room, he found a nurse already there, checking vitals with more urgency than usual. She turned to James with a look he hadn't seen before, surprise edged with cautious optimism. Kate had moved. Not a reflex, not a twitch, but actual, deliberate movement. Her fingers had curled around the bed sheet. Her eyelids had fluttered. There had even been a faint groan that broke through the silence of the room like the first crack of a frozen lake. James stepped closer, heart racing as he looked at her. She still lay still, her face pale and fragile, but there was unmistakable life beginning to surface. The nurse told him the doctors would be in soon to assess, but she didn't need to say more. James could already feel it, something was changing. He sat down in the chair he had claimed as his own and gently took her hand. He didn't speak at first. Just sat there, breathing with her, letting the moment ground him. Later that afternoon, Lily arrived holding a drawing she had made that morning, 3 figures standing under a tree, labeled carefully in her uneven handwriting, Mommy, me, and Daddy. She handed it to James with pride, unaware of the tears that stung his eyes as he looked at it. When he told her that her mom had started to wake up, her face lit up in a way he hadn't seen before. She didn't jump or scream. Instead, she just stood there very still, her eyes wide and hopeful. Then she whispered, "Can I talk to her?" James brought her to Kate's bedside and lifted her gently so she could be closer. Lily leaned in and rested her small hand on her mother's arm. "Hi, Mommy," she said quietly. "I'm here. And Daddy is here too. We've been waiting for you." Kate didn't respond, but her monitor began to change slightly, a subtle shift that the nurse watching from the door later confirmed as increased brain activity. Something about Lily's voice had reached her. James watched the moment unfold, emotion thick in his throat, and realized that even if Kate didn't fully wake up that day, the return had already begun. The following days were a blur of tests, cautious updates, and steady improvement. Kate's eyes finally opened 2 mornings later. At first she only blinked, her pupils slow to adjust to the light, her body weak and barely responsive. But she was awake. And she recognized him. Her gaze lingered on his face, her expression puzzled at first, then emotional, as if her mind was racing to put the puzzle together. She tried to speak, her voice hoarse and broken, but James leaned in, pressing her hand gently and shaking his head. "You don't have to say anything. I'm here," he said. "And I'm not going anywhere." Over the next few days, her voice returned in fragments. They kept conversations short at the doctor's request, but with every small exchange, James could feel something healing, not just in her, but in him too. The past began to come back, piece by piece. She remembered the accident, remembered taking Lily to the park, remembered the headache that struck just before she lost consciousness. Then one afternoon, When James was helping adjust her pillows, she looked at him and asked in a whisper, "Why did you come?" He paused, not because he didn't know the answer, but because there were too many. He looked at her and said quietly, "Because I had to. Because she called me. Because I should have never left in the first place." Kate closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. There was no bitterness in her expression, only exhaustion and maybe something softer, like forgiveness trying to find its way forward. That night, James walked Lily home from the hospital under a quiet sky. She reached for his hand without asking, and he held hers tightly. When they reached the apartment, she turned to him before going inside and said, "When Mommy gets better, will we still be together?" James crouched down to look her in the eyes, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "We're already together." And for the first time, it didn't feel like something he was trying to fix. It felt like something real, something earned. Something that was finally beginning. Kate's recovery unfolded slowly, with quiet victories that only those who had waited in uncertainty could truly appreciate. Each day brought a little more strength, a little more clarity. First came her ability to sit upright without support. Then, short walks with a physical therapist down the hallway, her steps shaky but determined. James was there for every milestone, not hovering, but present in the way that mattered, always in the room, always steady, always watching with the kind of focus she had never known from him before. They began to talk more. Not about the past at first, but about Lily, about routines, about her physical therapy schedule. James told her how Lily had managed the first night alone and how she had quietly taken over his mornings with requests for pancakes and cartoons before school. He made her laugh once, describing his failed attempt to braid Lily's hair, which had ended in knots and glitter everywhere. Kate smiled at that, her voice still thin but genuine when she said, "I didn't think you'd be the type to stick around." James didn't respond right away. He reached for her water cup, handed it to her, then sat back down. When he did answer, his voice was low and serious. "I wasn't the type. But I should have been. I'm trying to be now." There was no grand apology, no drawn-out explanation of why he left or why he never called. She didn't ask for one. Maybe she didn't need it. Maybe she already knew. Time had a way of stripping people down to the truth. They both understood more with silence than they had with words all those years ago. Meanwhile, Lily had grown even more attached to both of them. She transitioned seamlessly into a shared world that had once been divided by absence. After school, she spent afternoons with James at the hospital, bringing her books, stories, and drawings. Nurses came to recognize the three of them as a kind of unit. It was unspoken, but visible in every glance, every routine, every moment of quiet understanding between them. One evening, after Kate had been cleared to leave the hospital and had moved into a short-term rehabilitation apartment nearby, the three of them sat on a park bench across the street. It was sunset, and the light made everything feel suspended in warm gold. Lily was telling a long, winding story about her favorite teacher, while James and Kate listened like it was the most important thing in the world. When Lily ran ahead to chase a bird near the fountain, Kate turned to James. Her eyes were tired, but focused. "I don't want to go back to how things were before," she said. "Not just with you. With any of it. I used to run on autopilot, work, parenting, barely sleeping. I didn't realize how much of myself I'd buried." James nodded, understanding more than he could say. "I thought I had everything," he admitted. "But it turns out I was just busy. Not whole. You and Lily, you've changed that." Kate smiled, just faintly, and leaned her head back against the bench. "We've still got a lot to figure out." He looked toward Lily, who was now twirling with her arms out, letting the last light of day fall over her like a crown. "We'll figure it out," he said. "Together." There was no need for declarations or rushed decisions. They had already begun to rewrite everything, not in bold strokes, but in small, steady lines. The kind of changes that last. The kind that matter. The day of Lily's 7th birthday arrived with more sunlight than usual, as if the sky itself had decided to bless the occasion. It was a Saturday, warm and quiet, and James had insisted on planning everything himself. He rented out a small community garden near the rehab center, decorating it with streamers and pastel balloons. There were tables filled with cupcakes, sandwiches, and small bowls of fruit shaped like stars. Nothing extravagant, but every detail was intentional, thought through with the kind of care he'd never used for anything outside of business deals before. Kate stood by the entrance, still a little unsteady on her feet but stronger now. She wore a soft blue dress and had her hair loosely tied back. Watching James guide Lily around the garden, introducing her to a few local kids and helping her pick music for the little speaker they'd brought, she felt a knot rise in her chest. It wasn't grief or regret, it was something deeper, a strange, quiet mix of joy and disbelief. After everything they had been through, after all the uncertainty and absence, the three of them were standing in the same place, smiling. Living. When Lily spotted her mom, she ran over and threw her arms around Kate's waist. "Best day ever," she declared. "And we haven't even done presents." James joined them a minute later, holding something behind his back. Lily's eyes lit up immediately. "Is that for me?" she asked, already bouncing in place. He knelt in front of her and brought out a small, carefully wrapped box. Inside was a charm bracelet, delicate and silver, with one tiny charm already attached, a heart with her initial engraved on it. "Every year," he said, "we'll add one. Something that tells part of your story." Lily beamed, then surprised him by lunging forward and hugging him tight. "I love it," she said. "But you know what I really wished for?" "What?" James asked. She looked between him and Kate, then said without hesitation, "That we stay together. For good. Like a family." The words hung in the air, too sincere to ignore and too innocent to brush aside. Kate reached for Lily's hand and squeezed it. James looked at both of them and felt something shift inside him, not a decision, not a plan, but something rooted deeper than logic. A truth. He rose slowly and reached into his jacket again, this time pulling out a much smaller box. It was wrapped simply, no ribbons, no flash. Kate stared at it for a second before realization crept into her face. Her breath caught in her throat as he opened the box, revealing a modest but beautiful ring, classic, understated, perfect. "I don't want to rush you," he said, his voice low, steady. "And I don't expect anything to be like it was before. But I know who I am now. I know what matters. I want to be part of this life, with both of you. If you'll let me." Kate didn't speak right away. Lily looked up at her, holding her hand tightly. There were tears in Kate's eyes, but not from fear or confusion. They were from clarity. She nodded once, then whispered, "Yes." Lily clapped so hard she almost knocked over the cupcake table. The three of them laughed, a little breathless, a little overwhelmed, but entirely present. They didn't make promises about perfection. They didn't talk about the past like it needed fixing. Instead, they chose each other again, not in some grand gesture, but in a quiet moment filled with honesty and hope. For James, it wasn't about being the CEO, or the man with all the answers. For the first time, he was just someone's father. Someone's partner. Someone who had gotten a second chance and was brave enough to take it. As the sun dipped below the trees and the party wound down, Lily danced barefoot on the grass, twirling with the bracelet glittering on her wrist, and James looked over at Kate, who met his gaze with a small, certain smile. They didn't need anything else. They already had everything they hadn't even known they were missing. What makes the ending of this story so meaningful to me is that it doesn't rely on perfection, it leans into healing. It's not a fairy tale where everything magically falls into place. It's the story of people who were broken in quiet, private ways, finding their way back to something whole together. James doesn't just redeem himself by showing up, he earns his place slowly, with presence, with patience, with love. Kate's forgiveness isn't immediate, and that feels honest. She allows herself to be cautious, but she also allows herself to hope again. And Lily, in all her innocence and strength, becomes the bridge between what was and what could be. The proposal at the end isn't about romance in the traditional sense, it's about choosing family. It's about saying, we're better together, not because it's easy, but because it's real. I love that their happiness isn't loud. It's soft, steady, and deeply human. It reminds us that second chances aren't always given, they're built. And when they are, they're worth everything.
Two millionaire brothers had it all: power, success, an unbreakable bond, until the night they walked into a rundown diner and met a waitress who changed everything. She had nothing to her name, except the secret that would tear them apart and rewrite everything they thought they knew about love, loyalty, and themselves. The IPO party was too loud. Crystal glasses clinked against polished marble, photographers hovered like flies, and billion-dollar smiles flashed beneath glittering chandeliers. Lucas Bailey stood near the window of the high-rise ballroom, watching the city shimmer below, detached from the celebration he'd helped create. Across the room, his younger brother Aidan raised a glass, the center of yet another circle of investors and influencers, all laughing a little too loud at a story Aidan probably made up on the spot. Their company had just gone public, 3 years of chaos, sacrifice, sleepless nights, and now the world was calling them geniuses. But Lucas wasn't thinking about the valuation. He was thinking about how little any of it felt like victory. Around midnight, Aidan appeared beside him, unbuttoning the top of his shirt and wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "Let's get out of here," he said without looking. "Somewhere with real food. No cameras. No shrimp on sticks." Lucas didn't argue. 15 minutes later, they were walking down a quiet side street near the edge of the financial district, jackets off, ties undone, the tension of the day slowly draining from their shoulders. That's when they saw it, an old diner tucked between a dry cleaner and a pawn shop, still open, lights buzzing with a soft hum, neon sign flickering slightly. Inside, it smelled like burnt coffee and old vinyl booths. A few tired-looking people sat hunched over plates of pancakes and half-empty mugs. The brothers slid into a booth by the window, and that's when she walked over. She looked tired. Hair pulled into a loose bun. No makeup. No fake smile. Just calm, unreadable eyes and a notepad in one hand. "What'll it be?" she asked, voice low and even, like she'd said the phrase 1,000 times. Lucas didn't answer right away. There was something in the way she said it, like she wasn't really asking what they wanted to eat, but daring them to actually know what they wanted at all. Aidan grinned, trying to read the specials behind her, but his words caught somewhere between charm and surprise. Pancakes," he said eventually, then laughed. "Sorry. Long day." She nodded, barely reacting, and turned to Lucas. He just said, "Coffee," without looking up, eyes fixed on her apron, as if he was trying to understand something without knowing what he was even looking for. She disappeared behind the counter. Aidan nudged him. "You okay?" Lucas didn't answer. When she returned with the coffee and pancakes, she didn't say a word. But Lucas noticed the way she glanced at his hand, still wearing the watch their father had given them when the company was just an idea scribbled on a napkin. Then she turned and walked away, like none of this mattered, like she hadn't just shifted something subtle between them. They ate in silence for a while. Aidan cracked a few jokes, mostly to fill the space, but Lucas barely responded. Eventually, Aidan leaned in and said, "You're acting like a man who saw a ghost." Lucas looked up, eyes slightly narrowed, and said quietly, "That woman has more weight behind her eyes than half the boardroom combined." Aidan raised an eyebrow. "You've always been into tragic poetry. Maybe she's just tired." But Lucas didn't laugh. Because something in him had already decided she wasn't just tired. She was surviving. And he couldn't explain why, but he suddenly needed to know what exactly she'd survived. They left $100 tip and walked out into the night. The city didn't look quite the same. And neither did the brothers, though neither of them would admit it yet. Something had changed in that diner, something neither of them could name. But both of them would be back. Not for the pancakes. Not even for the coffee. For her. They came back 3 nights later. Not together, but almost as if by accident, though neither of them admitted it. Lucas arrived first, just after 9, dressed casually in a soft charcoal sweater and dark jeans, not the sharp suit he usually wore. He sat at the same booth by the window, ordered coffee again, and when she brought it without comment, he offered a quiet thanks that lingered a moment too long in the air. She nodded but didn't linger. Her name tag read Emma. He hadn't noticed that the first time. He said her name once, softly, just to himself after she walked away. At 9:24, Aiden walked in, surprised to see Lucas already there. He raised his eyebrows, smirking, as if to say, "Really? You too?" Lucas didn't answer. Aiden sat in the opposite booth, joking with the cook behind the counter like he'd been there a dozen times. Emma eventually came over, her eyes flicking briefly between the two brothers. She didn't ask why they were both there again. She simply took Aiden's order, waffles this time, and walked away like it meant nothing. But it didn't mean nothing. Not to either of them. For the next week, they returned again and again, always at different times, yet always with the same excuse: I was in the area. They never spoke about her directly, but something in their dynamic shifted. They were still building deals and fielding interviews, but conversations between them now came with an edge, shorter words, unspoken tension, occasional silences that hadn't been there before. Lucas started checking the diner's hours between meetings. Aiden would go out of his way after client dinners. Emma noticed. Of course she did. But she said nothing. She worked late shifts, cleaned up after drunk college kids, ignored comments, handled rude customers, and smiled only when she meant it, which was rare. But with them, something was different. She never flirted. She never lingered. Yet there was a quiet softness in how she poured Lucas's coffee or how she remembered Aiden's weird allergy to cinnamon without him ever asking. One night, it was raining hard. The streets shimmered with headlights and puddles. Lucas stayed late at the office, but something pulled him back to that diner again. When he walked in, she wasn't behind the counter. It was strange enough that he asked the new girl on shift. The response made him pause. "Emma?" She called out tonight. First time in months. That night, he didn't go home. He drove for an hour without direction, unsettled in a way he couldn't explain. The next day, she was back. Tired, paler than usual, but there. He didn't ask what had happened. Instead, he left a small note folded beneath his receipt that read, "If you ever need anything, you can ask me. No questions." He didn't sign it. She didn't mention it. But the next time he came in, there was a second sugar packet beside his coffee. He never used sugar. She knew that. It wasn't about the sugar. Meanwhile, Aiden took a different approach. He made her laugh. He started bringing her random things, books with sarcastic notes, playlists he'd burned onto old-school USB drives, even a tiny cactus once that she kept behind the counter. He flirted, but never aggressively. Just enough to make her smirk when she thought no one was watching. Still, there were moments when her gaze lingered a little longer on Lucas. Quiet moments. The kind that don't sparkle, they sink, deep and slow. And then came the night she didn't show up again. And this time, neither of them took it lightly. Aiden called the diner twice. Lucas drove by and saw the lights off earlier than usual. Something felt wrong. They didn't tell each other what they were thinking, but both of them understood the same thing: they weren't just curious anymore. They were invested. And not in the way they usually were. This wasn't a deal. This was something messier. Something personal. Emma didn't return to the diner for 3 days. Not one shift. Not a single word. No one knew where she was or why she'd vanished. The manager was tight-lipped, muttering something about personal leave, but it was clear no one had actually heard from her. Lucas heard it first during one of his late-night visits, and the moment the words left the cashier's mouth, something in him dropped. He left without finishing his coffee and didn't sleep that night. Aidan, meanwhile, showed up the following afternoon, laughing with the cook until he realized Emma wasn't in the kitchen. When he was told the same vague explanation, his expression shifted instantly. That night, he called Lucas. It was the first time they'd talked outside of work in weeks. "She's gone," Aidan said. "I know," Lucas answered. "What are we doing?" Aidan asked, his voice quieter now, more honest. "You feel it too, don't you?" Lucas didn't respond. There wasn't a point in pretending. They both knew. The next day, Aidan did something impulsive. He went to the manager and asked for Emma's emergency contact. Of course, they wouldn't give it, but money talks louder than policy. With a generous donation to the diner's struggling renovation fund, Aidan got a name, Sarah Clark. A contact number. An address across the city. Lucas found out the same way he always did, through one of the assistants, who noticed a car booked in Aidan's name headed toward a residential district. Lucas cancelled his meetings and followed. Not to interfere, he told himself, but because something inside him burned at the thought of Aidan being the one to see her first. Or worse, being the one she let in. They both arrived minutes apart. Aidan was already at the door, knocking, holding a box of soup and crackers like some kind of misplaced apology. Lucas parked down the street, walked up slowly, and the look on Aidan's face when he saw him wasn't angry, it was resignation. She opened the door. And for a moment, none of them spoke. Emma looked smaller than they remembered. Pale. No makeup. Wearing an oversized sweater and holding a phone in one hand, like she hadn't expected anyone to find her, let alone both of them. The apartment behind her was dark and quiet. No TV. No music. Just silence. "I'm fine," she said finally, her voice hoarse. "I just needed space." "You disappeared," Aidan replied gently. "You scared the hell out of us," Lucas added, tone lower. She hesitated before stepping aside. "You might as well come in. You're not the kind of men who go away easily." Inside, the apartment was almost bare. A small couch. A coffee table covered in books and empty tea mugs. A photo of a boy on the wall, smiling, maybe 15, with Emma beside him. Lucas stared at it. "My brother," she said, catching his gaze. "He died last year. Fentanyl. He was clean for 7 months, then, one night." Aidan sat down slowly. "I'm sorry. He was all I had left," she continued. "Mom's gone. Dad never existed. It's just been me since." Lucas stayed standing. "Why didn't you tell us?" She let out a bitter laugh. "Tell you what? That I was broken? That I'm not someone who fits into your world?" "No," Aidan said. "That you were human. That's all we needed." Emma looked between them. "I didn't want to be a problem. You two have this empire. The way you look at people, it's like you already know their value. I didn't want to be one more calculation." Lucas stepped forward. "You were never a calculation. I didn't want your pity either." "We don't pity you," Aidan said. "We admire you." She looked away, jaw tightening. "It's easier not to let anyone in. I learned that a long time ago." Lucas sat down finally. "Then why did you let us keep showing up?" Emma didn't answer right away. When she finally did, it was barely above a whisper. "Because for the first time in years, I wanted to be seen." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy, but necessary. Aidan leaned forward, elbows on his knees, looking at the floor. Lucas kept his eyes on her. They were both in the same place, stuck between who they were supposed to be, and who they were starting to become because of her. Emma stood. I need time. I don't know what this is, or what I want it to be. But I know I can't handle the two of you circling like I'm a prize. We're not circling, Lucas said. Yes, you are. You're brothers. But this will break you if you let it. She walked to the door and opened it, her meaning clear. They didn't argue. They just left. Quietly. Separately. That night, the Bailey brothers didn't speak. Not in person. Not by phone. For the first time, it wasn't about business. It was about her. And neither of them knew how to win without losing everything else. 3 weeks passed, and neither Lucas nor Aidan returned to the diner. Not because they didn't want to, but because something had broken wide open between them. For the first time in years, they avoided each other outside of meetings, conversations between them stripped down to bare necessities, calculated and impersonal. The usual flow of their business partnership, so smooth, so instinctive, became jagged. Decisions dragged longer, tempers flared quicker, and the team felt it. Even Monica, their longest-standing executive, mentioned it once during a tense strategy call. Whatever this is between you two, she said sharply, fix it. Because it's starting to bleed into the floor. Neither responded. Because neither knew how. Lucas buried himself in the back end of the company, locking himself in long negotiations, restructuring old projects, and sitting through hours of investor calls with the detachment of a machine. He became quieter, colder, as if freezing out everything around him would keep him from feeling too much. He thought of Emma constantly. In the late hours of the night when the office emptied, he would find himself staring at the photo of her brother she had in her apartment. The look on her face in that picture, hopeful, younger, whole, haunted him. He knew that version of her didn't exist anymore. And somehow, he hated that he hadn't known her then. Aidan, on the other hand, didn't hide how badly it affected him. He pulled back from work, missing calls, skipping meetings, disappearing into late nights and long weekends with no explanation. He started spending more time alone, in places that didn't require answers or expectations. The charm he usually wore like armor was gone. He couldn't fake it anymore. Not with her silence echoing louder than any rejection he'd ever known. And not with Lucas, who wouldn't even look him in the eye. One night, nearly a month after they'd last seen Emma, Lucas came home to find Aidan sitting on the steps of their father's old townhouse, the one neither of them had visited in years. It was raining lightly, the kind of soft spring rain that made the streets shimmer, and Aidan had a bottle of scotch resting at his feet. "You're late," Aidan said without looking up. "I wasn't planning to come." "You always say that before you do." Lucas sat down beside him without a word. For a long while, they just listened to the rain. When Aidan finally spoke again, his voice was low, rough around the edges. "I loved her," he said. "Still do, I think. Even if I barely know what that means." Lucas didn't answer right away. He stared out into the dark, heart heavier than he wanted to admit. "I think I did too," Lucas finally said. "But I don't know if it was love or something else. Something I hadn't felt in so long, I mistook it for love." "You think it matters?" Aidan asked, glancing over. Lucas shook his head. "Not to her. Not anymore." They sat like that for a long time. Brothers, not enemies, not rivals, just two men who had fallen for the same woman without knowing how to be honest about it. The silence between them was different now. Less sharp. More tired. "She's not coming back, is she?" Aidan asked. Lucas looked down. "Would you? If you were her?" Aidan laughed once, short and bitter. "No. I'd run." Lucas finally turned to face him. So what do we do now? Aiden exhaled. We stop making her the battlefield. And that was it. Not a resolution. Not forgiveness. But a truce. One born not from pride, but from exhaustion and clarity. The next morning, Lucas wrote an email to Emma. It wasn't long. No expectations. No confessions. Just a message that read, *, we're not fighting anymore. You don't owe either of us anything. But if you ever want to talk, to either of us, we'll be here. Separately. Respectfully, *. He didn't send it right away. He read it over and over again. Then he hit send. And for the first time in weeks, he exhaled without guilt. Emma read the email 3 times before she let herself respond. She wasn't angry anymore, not exactly. The storm of emotion that had knocked her flat when they both showed up at her door had passed, but what remained was a kind of wary caution, like the way a wounded animal approaches a hand that might be kind or cruel. She didn't know how to trust them, not fully. She didn't know if she wanted to. But there was something about the tone of the message, measured, quiet, without pressure, that made her consider it. Lucas had written it, she could tell. The restraint in his words gave him away. And while part of her still carried the ache of their unspoken rivalry, another part of her remembered how still she felt sitting across from him in that diner, just sipping coffee, just being. 2 days later, she replied with a single sentence. *, let's talk. Just you, *. They met in a park near the edge of the city, somewhere neutral, public, open. She arrived first, hands deep in the pockets of a faded green jacket, her hair pulled back in a low braid, no makeup. She looked tired, but steadier. Lucas approached slowly, holding 2 coffees from a shop down the street. He offered her one without a word, and she took it, their fingers brushing briefly. The moment was brief, but it rooted something. They sat on a bench overlooking a small pond where ducks moved lazily through the water. Emma didn't speak at first. She sipped her drink and watched the wind move through the trees, letting the silence stretch between them. Lucas didn't rush her. He'd learned by now that her quiet wasn't emptiness, it was calculation. Protection. "I thought you were both going to ruin each other," she said eventually, her voice soft but steady. "And I didn't want to be the reason." "You weren't," he said. "We almost did that on our own." Emma nodded slowly, as if she already knew. "I didn't expect either of you to get so tangled up in this. I didn't even realize it was happening until it was too late." Lucas set his coffee down and leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "I didn't either. At first, I thought it was just distraction. Curiosity. But then I started noticing little things, how I'd remember your voice when the room went quiet. How I'd find myself replaying conversations we never finished." Emma's lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile. "And Aiden? He loved how alive you made him feel," Lucas said honestly. "You reminded him that he had a heart, and he chased that like oxygen. But I think he knew early on that he wasn't the one you looked at when you were quiet." Emma looked at him then, really looked. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" "I didn't want to be another person trying to take something from you," he said. "So I waited. And then it was too late." "No," she said, shaking her head gently. "It wasn't too late. I just needed to see if either of you would stop trying to win me." They sat in silence again, this time softer. The pond shimmered under the late afternoon sun, and a child nearby laughed as her dog pulled at the leash. The noise grounded them in the real world, in the ordinariness of it all, and somehow that made the moment feel even more important. Lucas turned to her. "I'm not asking for anything. Not today. Not ever, unless you want to give it. But I'm here, Emma. And I'm not going anywhere." She looked down at her coffee, then back at him. What if I don't know what I want? Then we wait, he said. Not together. Not apart. Just, honestly. For the first time in weeks, her shoulders relaxed. There was no weight hanging over the moment. No pressure to fix everything. No ticking clock. They parted without touching, but with something stronger than contact. A fragile understanding. The kind of quiet that grows roots slowly. That night, Emma sat in her apartment with the lights low, rereading old journal entries she hadn't touched since her brother died. She thought about grief, about survival, and about the strange, steady presence Lucas had become without even trying. She didn't know what would happen next. But for the first time, she wanted to find out. The following weeks unfolded in slow, unremarkable pieces, like puzzle parts slipping into place without fanfare. Emma and Lucas didn't fall into anything dramatic or rushed. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping moments of cinematic romance. Instead, it began in the small things, short text messages, unexpected coffees left at her doorstep, and quiet walks that ended in silence rather than goodbyes. Lucas had learned to match her pace, and Emma had learned that not all stillness was a threat. Sometimes, stillness meant safety. Trust came in fragments. She'd ask him questions she'd been afraid to ask before, about his parents, his first failure, the last time he felt alone even in a crowded room. He didn't deflect anymore. He answered, sometimes after long pauses, sometimes with answers that didn't come out smooth but came out real. That was what mattered. Lucas, for his part, found himself changing in ways he hadn't expected. He stopped filling his calendar to the edge. He took long drives without a destination. He stopped checking his phone every 10 minutes. When Emma spoke, he listened, not just with attention, but with the kind of quiet that invited her to say more. He didn't ask for closeness, but she gave it anyway, piece by piece, until one evening she fell asleep on his shoulder during a movie, and he didn't move for an hour, afraid to break the weight of her trust. Aidan had stayed away. They exchanged emails about the company, cordial, efficient, but the distance between them hadn't healed. Lucas carried guilt for that, a quiet one he didn't share. He knew Aidan hadn't been ready for what happened. He also knew Aidan hadn't fought dirty, hadn't manipulated Emma, hadn't tried to win at the cost of anyone else. In a way, that made the silence worse. There was no betrayal to blame. Just loss. Then, on a warm afternoon in early spring, Aidan showed up. Lucas found him standing in the lobby of their office building, hands in his pockets, sunglasses still on. He looked thinner, a little tired, but calmer somehow, like the edge of him had worn down with time. Lucas didn't say anything at first. He just nodded toward the elevator. They stood together in his office, city skyline stretching behind them. Neither sat. "She's doing okay," Lucas said finally. "I know," Aidan replied. "I saw her last week." Lucas tensed, but Aidan raised a hand. "Relax. It wasn't like that. I was at the center she volunteers at. Didn't even know she'd be there. We talked. For 5 minutes." Lucas looked down. "How was she?" "Stronger than ever," Aidan said. "And she looked at me like someone she used to know. Not someone she needed." Lucas exhaled slowly. "I didn't plan for this." "I know," Aidan said. "Neither did I." They stood in silence for a moment, something old breaking between them, not with anger, but with honesty. Aidan finally stepped forward and said, "You didn't steal her from me. She just saw you." Lucas looked at him then, something like pain flickering across his face. "I never wanted to lose you over this." "You didn't," Aidan said. "I left. I needed to. But I'm back now. And I think I'm ready to stop holding that against you." Lucas nodded, his throat tight. "You think we can fix this?" "We won't fix it by pretending it didn't happen," Aidan said. But maybe we can start with dinner. And no business talk. That night, Lucas told Emma about the meeting. She listened without interrupting, her fingers curled around a tea mug, her eyes soft. "That's good," she said simply. "You need your brother." Lucas looked at her for a long time. "And what do you need?" Emma smiled faintly. "Time. Space. But also, this. Right here." They didn't say anything else for a while. But Lucas reached across the table, took her hand, and held it like he'd never known how to before. And she let him. Spring turned into early summer with little ceremony. The city shed its grayness, and warmth spread across sidewalks and storefronts, a quiet kind of renewal that felt personal to Emma, even if the rest of the world didn't notice. She had begun to breathe differently, more deeply, without the constant bracing for loss. Her apartment started to feel less like a place she was surviving in and more like a place she could return to. There were books by the windowsill now, mugs that didn't match but felt like home, and a plant Lucas had brought her without asking if she even wanted one. She did. She just didn't know it until she started talking to it. Lucas became part of her life without intruding on it. He wasn't trying to fix her anymore. He had stopped offering solutions, stopped showing up with carefully crafted plans, and instead started showing up just to sit next to her while she worked, or to walk her home from the center when she stayed too late. Their connection had shed its sharp edges, and in its place was something quieter, something that didn't need to prove itself. Sometimes they spoke for hours, sometimes not at all. He never reached for more than she gave. But when she gave, small gestures, passing touches, a look that lingered longer than before, he held those moments like they were the most important things in the world. One Saturday, Lucas invited her to a dinner party. It was a small gathering, board members, a few team leads, some longtime friends of the company. He didn't pressure her, only said he'd like her there. She hesitated at first, unsure of how she'd fit into a room full of polished people with generational money and practiced smiles. But something in her shifted, and for the first time, she didn't let fear write the ending. She said yes. She wore a simple black dress and no jewelry. Her hair was down, loose around her shoulders, and she wore a shade of lipstick that looked like it might have been a dare she gave herself. Lucas didn't compliment her with empty words, he just looked at her for a moment longer than usual when she arrived, and said, "You're here." That was enough. The night started slow. People smiled politely, asked vague questions, didn't quite know how to place her. She didn't apologize for being out of place. She didn't shrink. She listened more than she spoke, offered honest responses, and didn't pretend to be anyone but herself. By the end of the night, one of the guests, a woman from an education nonprofit, had pulled her aside and asked if she'd consider consulting on a community program. Lucas watched it unfold from across the room, something blooming behind his eyes that looked a lot like pride. After the last of the guests left, Lucas and Emma remained in the garden behind the townhouse, the glow of string lights warming the space between them. She slipped off her heels and curled her toes into the grass. He handed her a glass of something cold and citrusy, then leaned against the railing, watching her instead of the stars. "I've never brought anyone into this world before," he said, quiet and almost uncertain. Emma tilted her head. "Why now?" He didn't answer right away. Then, "Because you make it feel like it doesn't own me anymore." She took a step closer, setting her glass down. "You don't have to be one version of yourself all the time, you know. You can be all the messy, quiet, strong, complicated pieces. I don't need the man in the suit. I just want the one who sits with me on Tuesdays when I can't sleep." Lucas looked at her like she'd just said something sacred. "I don't want to go back to how it was before you." Emma smiled, not wide, but slow and certain. "Then don't." He reached for her hand then, not suddenly, but like he'd been waiting to do it right. And when their fingers met, she didn't pull away. In the stillness of the garden, under a sky not quite dark and not quite morning, something shifted between them again, not with urgency, but with quiet certainty. Not because it was perfect, but because it was finally real. Emma didn't tell Lucas she loved him the first time she realized it. It came to her quietly, in the middle of an ordinary morning while they were at the grocery store, of all places. He was arguing with an elderly woman over the last loaf of fresh sourdough and somehow managed to charm her into giving it up without even trying. Emma stood a few feet away, watching the exchange unfold like a scene from someone else's life, and something inside her just softened completely. There was no cinematic music playing, no moment of clarity that felt like a climax, just a deep, still knowing that this man, with all his restraint and history and slow patience, had taken up permanent space in her heart. But she didn't say it. Not because she was afraid he wouldn't feel the same, but because she wanted it to come out at the right time, when the words wouldn't feel like pressure but like truth. That truth came 3 weeks later, on the anniversary of her brother's death. She hadn't told Lucas what the date meant until the day before. Even then, she downplayed it, pretending she didn't want to make a big deal out of it, acting like it was just another difficult day that she knew how to get through. Lucas didn't try to change her mind. He just said, "I'll be there," and he was. They went to the cemetery early, before the sun had fully risen, the sky still painted in silver and blue. Emma carried 2 paper cranes in her jacket pocket, one she had folded the night before, one for her brother, one for herself. She didn't speak much while they were there, and Lucas didn't ask her to. Afterward, they drove with no destination in mind until they found themselves by a lake she used to visit with her brother when they were kids. They sat on the edge of the dock, their legs hanging over the water, the breeze cool against their faces. Emma leaned her head against Lucas's shoulder, eyes half closed, body heavy with memory and grief, but not alone this time. He wrapped an arm around her gently and didn't speak until she did. "I thought I'd feel empty today," she said quietly. "But I don't. I miss him, but it's not just loss anymore. It's memory. And gratitude. And maybe a little peace." Lucas looked down at her, brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You're the strongest person I know." Emma shook her head. "I'm not. I just learned how to survive." "No," he said. "You learned how to live. That's harder." And that's when she said it. Not with fanfare or build-up, but simply, with her eyes still focused on the lake. "I love you." The words didn't tremble. They didn't ask for anything. They just arrived, fully formed, as if they'd always been there waiting to be spoken. Lucas didn't answer right away. He turned, placing his hand on hers, and the look in his eyes said everything before his voice did. "I love you too. I think I have for a long time. I just didn't know how to let myself say it." Emma smiled softly, not with relief, but with recognition. She had finally let herself believe that this was real. That love could come slowly and still be true. That it didn't have to hurt to be meaningful. They stayed by the lake until the sun reached its peak, warm light spilling over the water and painting the day in gold. There were no big decisions made, no promises about forever, no talk of what came next. But as they drove home in silence, their fingers intertwined between them on the center console, the space between them filled with something better than certainty, it was peace. Later that week, Emma received a letter in the mail. It was from Aidan. A simple, handwritten note. He told her he'd found work with a relief organization overseas, helping rebuild schools and teaching English. He said he'd found clarity, and though he didn't regret the way he'd felt for her, he was glad she had found someone who could meet her where she stood. He ended with a line that stuck in her chest for days, "Some people are lessons. Some are homes. I think you were both." She cried after reading it, not out of sadness, but because it felt like the last missing piece falling gently into place. By summer's end, Emma had joined the nonprofit board Lucas helped fund, and she started writing again, not just in journals, but essays, short stories, even the beginnings of a book. Her past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer controlled her. She still visited her brother's grave. Still folded paper cranes. Still wore that same green jacket on the days she needed to feel grounded. But she smiled more now. And when she smiled, it reached all the way into her eyes. Lucas, meanwhile, returned to work with a new kind of balance. He still ran the company, still sat in meetings, still built deals, but he didn't do it from behind a wall anymore. He kept a photo of Emma on his desk, not one where she posed or smiled for the camera, but one he had taken quietly, on a walk, when she was staring up at the sky, her eyes reflecting something bigger than either of them. And on some evenings, when they sat together with music playing low and no need to fill the silence, Lucas would reach for her hand the same way he did on the dock. Every time, she would let him. Because she had chosen him. And he had never stopped choosing her. What makes the ending of this story resonate is that it doesn't rely on dramatic twists or forced closure. It honors the slow, painful, and deeply human journey of healing, for Emma, for Lucas, and even for Aiden. There's no perfect victory here, only real growth, earned connection, and quiet emotional redemption. Emma doesn't become someone new, she becomes more herself. Lucas doesn't sweep in as a savior, he learns to show up without fixing, without control, just with presence. Aiden's path, though it ends in distance, isn't a loss, it's a necessary step toward his own peace. This is a story where love doesn't come in grand gestures, but in steady hands, in being seen, and in choosing someone without needing to own them. To me, that's not just a romantic ending, it's a mature, honest one. And those are the endings that stay with us.